Everyone in Harlan County could tell you what progress looked like in 1967 because it rolled past their mailboxes with shiny paint, new rubber, and a payment book tucked in the glove compartment on the first cool morning of September. While men were at the Longhorn Cafe in the town of Harlan drinking coffee and talking corn prices, like they could talk the market into behaving, Charlie Hayes was already out on County Road 17 with his old Farmall M built in 1947. It coughed steady smoke and pulled a disc harrow that looked older than some of the jokes told inside that cafe. But it did the job, and Charlie wasn't the kind of man who needed applause for doing a job. If you drove past him, you might have laughed, because plenty of folks did. They would wave from the high seat of their new John Deere 4020s or International 806s. The kind of wave that looked friendly until you understood it was a victory lap. New paint and horsepower were everywhere that year. The implement dealer in Kearney had hung banners that said finance available and called it opportunity. And Farmers National Bank in Kearney was ready to turn signatures into machines. 5% interest, nothing down, 7 years to pay. And a man could drive home in something that made his neighbors stare. Folks called it modern. Folks called it smart. Folks called it the future. Charlie heard all of it because he sat with the others most mornings. Same booth by the window. Black coffee, eggs, toast, and the patience of a man who didn't need to win a conversation. Dale Mortensen was usually the loudest, because Dale had the newest everything and needed people to notice. Vernon Pike would lean back and grin like the show was for him. And Bob Henshaw would add little comments that made the younger men laugh, because laughing was cheaper than admitting they were nervous. Martha Cook kept the coffee coming and pretended not to listen, but she heard everything in that room. Even Sheriff Patterson, when he stopped in for a slice of pie, had an opinion about tractors and loans, like debt was just another kind of weather that moved through the county. Dale owned 100 acres and rented another 80, and he had just brought home a deer so fresh it still smelled like the dealer's shop. "You have to scale up," Dale would say, tapping his cigarette on the saucer. "You can't do this with old iron anymore. You want to stay in the game, you invest. You borrow to grow. That's how it works now." Men would nod because nodding felt like belonging. Some nodded because they'd already signed their names and needed the story to be true. Dale would talk about speed and efficiency, about getting more acres covered before the weather turned, about how a man who hesitated would get left behind. He talked like the bank was a partner instead of a leash. Charlie would listen and keep his eyes on his plate. He wasn't shy and he wasn't afraid of those men. But he had learned something early. The loudest man at a cafe table is usually trying to drown out a quieter fear. Dale's fear was simple. Dale owed money. Dale owed money on the tractor, money on seed, money on fertilizer, and money on the land he didn't own yet. Dale could not say that out loud, so he dressed it up as ambition and called it modern. Charlie didn't call it anything. He just said, "Sounds like a lot of work," and let that be enough. What nobody in that cafe crowd knew, because Charlie Hayes was not a man who told his business, was that the old Farmall wasn't a symbol of stubbornness. It was a strategy. Every month, after he paid his regular mortgage note, Charlie drove into Kearney with a second envelope and put it on Kenneth Hollister's desk at Farmers National. Kenneth was the loan officer, a careful man with neat handwriting and a habit of making sure every column lined up. He had watched plenty of men add debt like they were stacking hay bales, and he had watched plenty of those stacks fall. Charlie was different. Charlie didn't come in asking what he could afford. Charlie came in asking what he could kill. The mortgage on the Hayes place had been taken out years back, and Charlie had inherited it along with the land and the quiet responsibility that came with land. His father, Henry Hayes, had been the kind of farmer who didn't say much unless it mattered, and when Henry died, the last thing he made Charlie promise was simple and heavy: don't let the bank own what the family bled for. Charlie took that promise like he took everything else, as a duty, not a speech. So he cut corners that didn't show, the kind that don't earn compliments. He drove older trucks. He repaired his own equipment. He bought seed when he could, not when he wanted. He kept a notebook in the kitchen drawer with the date of every payment, regular and extra. And he watched the balance drop like a man watching a fence line straighten out. Kenneth Hollister had once told him, "Mr. Hayes, most people come in here to see how far they can stretch. You come in here to see how fast you can shrink." Charlie had shrugged and said, "I just want it done." That was why the jokes didn't bother him the way people assumed they would. A shiny tractor can make a man look rich while he is borrowing every inch of it. A worn tractor can make a man look poor while he is buying his freedom one payment at a time. Charlie didn't explain that at the Longhorn Cafe because he hated preaching. He believed if a man's choices were right, time would say it for him. The first real crack in Harlan County's polite story about progress came late that September. And it didn't come from a market report or a government program. It came from a fence. Dale Mortensen was working the edge of his south field with that new Deere 4020, running a plow through corn stubble like he was trying to prove to the ground that he owned it. He was pushing hard because the payment on that tractor was due, whether the weather cooperated or not, and because a man who signs a note wants to believe the note bought him control. Dale came down the row a little too close to the boundary. The rear wheel climbed a low mound, and the plow swung wide. Metal caught wire with a sound like teeth snapping. The corner post shuddered, snapped, and fell, and a section of fence sagged into the dirt. Charlie heard it from the shed. He walked over and stood by the broken post. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He looked at the splintered oak, the twisted wire, then up at Dale. "You caught it," Charlie said. Dale climbed down, boots clean, shirt still crisp. "It's nothing," he said too quickly. "Just a fence. It keeps cattle where they belong," Charlie said, calm. Dale waved a hand like he was brushing away a fly. "Fence was probably rotten anyway, Charlie. Looks like it's been there since Roosevelt." Charlie picked up the post and showed the pale fresh wood where it had snapped. "Treated oak," he said. "Galvanized wire. Put it up myself in '59. It wasn't rotten." Dale's face reddened. He hated being corrected, and he hated being corrected by Charlie. "I'm busy," he said. "I've got ground to turn before the weather changes." Charlie nodded. "So do I. You broke it. You fix it today. 2 o'clock. I've got wire and posts." The idea of Dale Mortensen spending an afternoon digging holes and stretching wire like a hired hand lit something sharp inside him. He had been treated like a rising man since he bought that tractor. The dealer called him sir. The banker called him partner. The cafe crowd called him smart. Now Charlie Hayes, with grease on his hands and a tractor older than Dale's pride, was telling him to show up at 2 and do manual work. Dale looked at the broken fence, then at Charlie, and you could see the fight in him. Not a fight about a fence, but a fight about who got to feel superior. "You know what your problem is, Charlie?" Dale snapped. "You're still farming like it's 1940. You're out here with that museum piece, wasting time on fences, probably still doing things the hard way because you don't know any better. The rest of us are building real operations, modern farms. You're holding on to the past like some stubborn fool." Charlie let the words hit him and fall. Then he said, quiet as a closing door, "Maybe so. But my fence is broken, and you broke it. I'll expect you at 2. He turned and walked back toward his shed because he had learned that arguing with a man like Dale only gave Dale more room to talk, and Charlie didn't feel like breathing for him. 2 o'clock came. Dale didn't. 3 o'clock came. Dale's tractor was still moving in the distance, turning dirt like he could plow away responsibility. Charlie fixed the fence himself because fences don't care about ego. He dug new holes with a hand auger until his shoulders burned, set new posts, pulled wire tight with a come-along, and worked until the light went flat and the evening chill settled in. He didn't tell anyone about it the next morning because he wasn't looking for sympathy. He drank his coffee, listened, and kept his hands steady on the cup. Dale told the story instead. He told it at the Longhorn Cafe like it was a joke, turning Charlie into a punchline. He made Charlie sound like a backward hermit who wouldn't accept that farming had changed. A man too stubborn or too poor to keep up. A few men laughed because laughing was easier than admitting they'd signed papers that scared them. A few looked down at their cups. Ed Winters, who usually stayed out of trouble, said, "Seems like you could have helped Dale." Dale shot him a glare and said, "I've got more important work than babysitting fences." Vernon Pike chuckled like it was harmless, and Bob Henshaw tried to smooth it over with a joke. But the air at the table tightened anyway, the way it does when someone refuses a basic kind of fairness. Charlie sat there and said nothing, but something in him settled into place. Dale wasn't just showing off. Dale was scared, and the louder he got, the more scared he was. That is how it works. A man who feels solid doesn't need to belittle another man's tractor. That afternoon, Charlie drove into Kearney with another envelope. He walked into Farmers National, nodded to the teller, and waited while Kenneth Hollister finished with another customer. Kenneth came out with his folder and his careful smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "you're early this month." Charlie set the envelope on the desk. "Sold to calves," he said. Kenneth counted, wrote the receipt, and slid the ledger toward him. The balance dropped again. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing anyone would clap for, but real. Charlie stared at the number the way some men stared at a new tractor brochure. Kenneth said, almost softly, "If rates climb next year, you'll be glad you're ahead." Charlie nodded once. He didn't know what next year would bring. He only knew what he could control: work, restraint, and another payment. On the drive home, he passed Dale's place. Dale's deer sat by the shed like a trophy, and Dale was outside wiping dust off the hood as if dust was an insult. When Charlie drove by, Dale didn't wave. He watched, jaw tight, like Charlie's truck was just another thing he couldn't push out of his way. Back at the Longhorn Cafe the next morning, someone brought up the bank again. Not Charlie's mortgage, nobody knew that story, but the bank in general and the way money was getting tighter. Heard Farmers National might bump rates, a man said, like he was talking about rain. Government squeezing credit, Dale scoffed. "Rates don't matter if you're expanding," he said. "You make more and you pay it." Charlie kept drinking his coffee. He didn't argue, but when he stepped outside, the air had that thin edge it gets before a shift, and the weather report on the radio in Martha's kitchen said a warm spell was coming. Then a line of rain behind it. Men in Harlan County listened to weather the way they listened to money, because both could ruin you if you got cocky. Dale pushed his chair back and said he'd better get after it, and a couple of the others nodded like soldiers hearing a whistle. Charlie didn't hurry in that showy way, but he left his cup empty, paid his check, and stepped into his pickup with the same quiet focus he carried into the bank. He had ground to work, too, and he knew something else the loud men didn't like to say: when a wet year turns mean. Horsepower doesn't matter much if the ground decides to say no, and that decision was coming fast. The warm spell arrived exactly the way the radio said it would, sliding up from the south and settling over Harlan County like a false promise. And for a few days, it felt like September had decided to forgive everyone at once, because the mornings came soft instead of sharp and the ground held just enough moisture to work without fighting back, and men took that as permission to hurry. Dale Mortensen hurried more than most. He was out before sunup, running that John Deere for 1,020 hard, turning ground fast and wide, telling himself that speed was control and control was safety. Because when you owed as much as Dale owed, you learned to confuse motion with security. He talked about it at the cafe, about how many acres he'd covered in a day, about how the tractor barely broke a sweat, and men listened because they wanted to believe that iron could outwork risk. Charlie Hayes listened too, but he measured time differently. He watched the soil when he stepped off the Farmall, pressed a clod between his fingers, smelled the damp underneath the surface, and thought about what happened when warmth stayed too long and rain followed close behind. He'd seen it before. A warm September didn't mean mercy. It meant trouble if you mistook it for October. When the rain came, it came steady, not violent, just enough to change everything. Roads went slick. Fields went dark. The kind of rain that doesn't flood you out but makes the ground heavy, sticky, unforgiving. It rained for 6 days. Men stood at windows and stared at calendars. At the Longhorn Cafe, the talk shifted from horsepower to worry. Seed sat in barns. Notes sat on kitchen tables. The warmth broke overnight, the way it sometimes does on the plains, and the temperature dropped hard, freezing the top while the bottom stayed soft, turning the ground into a trap that looked solid until it wasn't. Ray Kellerman was the first to try it anyway, because Ray had seed paid for and no patience left. He hooked his grain drill behind a new International 1,206 and told himself the weight would keep it steady. It didn't. Within an hour, the rear wheels were buried, spinning slow and useless, diesel smoke lifting into cold air, and Ray stood there staring like he'd been betrayed by a friend. It took a wrecker to pull him free, cost him money he hadn't planned to spend, and the transmission never sounded right after. Dale watched and told himself he'd be smarter. He switched implements, tried to scratch the surface with a lighter disc, but the deer sank anyway, front end dropping into a soft pocket that had been hidden just well enough to fool him. It took 2 tractors and 3 days to pull it out, and when it came free, something was bent, something was leaking, and Dale felt the first real fear cut through his confidence. Half the county lost the window, winter wheat that never went in, seed money gone, repairs piling up. The cafe grew quieter. Men stared at cups longer. Complaints replaced bragging. No one laughed much. Through it all, Charlie Hayes planted his 40 acres in the 3rd week of October. Before the rain, with a pull-type drill he'd bought used years back, light enough to float where the ground wanted to give. And he ran it the way he ran everything else, steady, patient, knowing every low spot because he'd been walking that ground since he was a boy. By the time frost locked the surface, green shoots were already showing through in Charlie's field. Stubborn and alive, nobody congratulated him. Nobody mentioned it at the cafe. Pride can make a room very quiet. December came down hard and stayed there. Wind from the north cut through coats and into bones. Men retreated to shops and kitchens and meetings where they could complain about government policy and prices and the way things used to be without admitting how scared they were. Charlie spent December in his equipment shed, breath fogging in the air, tearing down the Farmall's generator, replacing gaskets, cleaning contacts, doing the kind of work that looks pointless until the moment it saves you. He liked the order of it. A machine doesn't lie. You take it apart, you see what's wrong, you fix it, and it does what it's supposed to do again. People were harder. 3 days after Christmas, the letter arrived from Farmers National Bank in Kearney, and Charlie read it at the kitchen table with the same calm he brought to everything else, until he got to the numbers. Interest rates adjusting February 1st. Federal regulations. Increased costs. For most folks, it meant higher monthly payments. For Charlie, it meant a narrowing window. He did the math without paper because he'd been doing it for years. $7,800 left. At the rate he was going, he could make it by September, just before his 40th birthday. But if rates jumped and his extra payments had to shrink, that promise to his father would slide out of reach, not because he failed, but because the rules moved. Charlie sat there a long time. He didn't curse. He didn't slam the table. He thought about what he could do that didn't involve asking permission. He thought about what he knew. After the mud and the broken machines of November, there were tractors all over Harlan County that weren't right. Tractors with bent parts, leaking lines, transmissions that complained under load. Dealers were busy and expensive. Men were nervous about more bills. Charlie had fixed his own equipment his whole life, and he'd fixed neighbors' machines when asked. The way it had always been done. He decided to stop waiting to be asked. He mentioned, quietly, that he could help. Half-dealer rates, cash, same day if possible. Ray Kellerman called first. His International 1206 wouldn't shift right. The dealer wanted $800. Charlie came out on a Saturday with his toolbox in the back of his Ford, worked 6 hours, replaced what needed replacing, adjusted what needed adjusting, and when Ray drove it, the gears slid smooth. Ray paid $200 in cash and told 3 other men before Sunday dinner. Word moved faster than pride. By the end of January, Charlie had fixed tractors, combines, a grain truck, a pickup that wouldn't start in cold weather. He worked 16-hour days, farming his own ground in the morning and evening, driving back roads in between, hands black with grease, back tired but straight. He put every dollar toward the mortgage. When February came and rates changed, Charlie owed $4,100. He was closer, but the clock was louder now. Dale Mortensen heard about the repairs and hated every detail. The man he'd mocked was keeping everyone else running. The man with the museum tractor was suddenly essential. Dale needed work done too. His deer pulled left, the axle still angry from November. But he would rather pay the dealer double than ask Charlie. Pride is expensive that way. By March, Charlie was known as the man you called when you couldn't afford not to work. By May, the balance was down to $1,800. That was when Dale decided he'd had enough. He went to the county commissioners and talked about regulations and zoning and fairness, about unlicensed businesses and liability, dressed his resentment up like concern. Ed Winters came out to Charlie's place, uncomfortable, and explained the problem. Variance needed. Planning commission. Dale sat on it. Charlie listened and nodded. He asked when the meeting was. He kept working until then, because work was the only thing he trusted. At the meeting in June, the room was full of farmers who'd paid him cash and gratitude. Dale spoke first, polished and sharp, talking about rules. Charlie spoke after, plain and honest, about a promise and a deadline. When Vernon Pike asked how long he needed, Charlie said through September. When the vote came, Dale was alone. The variance passed. Outside, men lined up to ask for help. Charlie booked through harvest. Dale sat in his truck and watched respect move without him. Summer burned hot. Charlie worked harder. By August, the mortgage was down to $450. He could see the end. That was when Dale's deer caught fire in a dry alfalfa field and burned like a confession. Insurance covered the hay, not the tractor. Dale lost money he didn't have. He drove to Charlie's place furious and desperate, blamed him, threatened him, promised trouble. Charlie told him to leave. Dale went to the bank and tried again. Kenneth Hollister read the file and sent him away. On September 7th, Charlie walked into Farmers National with cash in an envelope and paid the land off. Kenneth shook his hand. Charlie drove home owning his ground. On September 11th, Dale came with gasoline in the dark. Charlie was waiting. He could have ended it there. He didn't. He gave Dale a choice that hurt more than punishment. Clean it up, go home. Be better for your boy. Dale broke and did as told. The sun came up on a quiet farm. Charlie watched it without celebration. He had work to do, land to tend, and a promise kept, which was enough. By early March of 1968, the talk in Harlan County had changed again. Not loud like it had been in the fall, but tight and cautious. The way men talk when they realize the margin for error is gone and every decision carries weight. Winter had loosened its grip just enough to let machinery move again. And that was when the real bills came due. Repairs from November showed up in neat envelopes. Interest adjustments showed up in smaller print. Men who had bragged a year before now spoke in half sentences. Because confidence is easy when nothing has gone wrong, but humility arrives fast when it does. Charlie Hayes felt the pressure too, but his pressure had a shape he could see. $4,100 after February, then less. Every repair job, every long day, made the number smaller, and the smaller it got, the heavier it felt. Because getting close to something you have chased for 15 years sharpens fear, instead of easing it. He did not tell anyone how close he was. He did not need encouragement, and he did not trust pity. He worked. He rose before daylight, fed his stock, checked his fields, then drove out with his toolbox rattling in the back of the Ford, following directions scribbled on scraps of paper. Farm names, crossroads, landmarks everyone in the county knew. A red barn with a tin roof. The place past the cottonwoods. Turn left at the broken windmill. He crawled under tractors in cold sheds, pulled housings apart, pressed bearings, cut gaskets from old material when the right ones were backordered, and put machines back together with the quiet satisfaction of a man solving problems he understood. He charged fair, and he charged less than the dealers, not because he wanted to undercut anyone, but because he believed a man should be able to work without sinking deeper into debt. For the privilege, he kept his own books in the same kitchen drawer notebook, writing down cash received dates, and a running total he did not show to anyone else. When he drove into Kearney, he carried envelopes thick enough to feel like something solid in his pocket, and Kenneth Hollister watched the balance drop with a kind of professional respect. Kenneth had seen desperation before. This was different. This was focus. Dale Mortensen watched from a distance and told himself stories that made sense to him. He told himself Charlie was skirting rules, that cash work meant cheating somewhere, that the county would never allow a man to run a business out of an agricultural shed. If someone pushed hard enough, Dale had always believed systems existed to protect men like him, men who played big and took risks, because risk sounded noble when you called it growth. The fire that had taken his tractor was still fresh in his mind. The smell of burned paint and rubber clinging to his clothes long after the field had cooled. Insurance money had covered some losses, but not the worst one. And the loan on the deer still existed even if the deer did not. Dale had begun to wake up at night thinking about numbers, about dates circled on calendars, about how fast respect evaporated when you could not deliver what you promised. He could not stand that Charlie Hayes, of all people, was becoming useful. He went to the county commissioners not in a rage, but with a folder and practiced concern. He spoke about zoning, about fairness, about legitimate businesses and liability, because he knew the language that opened doors. When Ed Winters drove out to County Road 17 to talk to Charlie, he did not like what he was doing, but he believed in procedure, and procedure was a kind of order he could trust. Charlie listened without interrupting, wiped his hands on a rag, and asked one question that mattered. "When is the meeting?" Ed told him. Charlie nodded and went back to work. He did not call anyone. He did not rehearse a speech. He did not complain at the cafe. He kept his head down and finished the jobs he had promised, because he had learned long ago that panic wastes energy you might need later. The Planning Commission meeting in June filled the basement of the courthouse in a way it rarely did. Folding chairs scraped the floor. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Men who rarely sat still inside a building waited quietly, because this mattered to them in a way no ordinance usually did. Dale arrived early, suit pressed, tie straight, the picture of a man who belonged at the front of the room. Charlie arrived on time, clean shirt, good boots, hat in his hands. When Vernon Pike called the item, Dale spoke first, measured and sharp, painting Charlie's work as a threat to order, to legitimate commerce, to the way things were supposed to be done. He did not mention envy. He did not mention fear. He did not mention his own debts. Charlie spoke next. He did not argue law. He did not accuse. He explained who he was, what he was doing, and why. He talked about his father, about the land, about a promise, and about a deadline. He said he did not want to run a business forever. He wanted time. When Vernon Pike asked how much time, Charlie said through September. That was all. The vote came quickly. Dale sat rigid as hands went up around him. Outside, men clapped Charlie on the shoulder, thanked him, asked when he could come by. Charlie scheduled work and went home. He did not feel victory. He felt relief, and relief can make a man dangerous if he mistakes it for the end. Summer came in hard and dry, the kind of heat that drains you without drama. Charlie worked through it, sweat cutting lines through dust on his arms, back aching, hands nicked and blackened, mind always counting. By late July, the balance was 900. By mid-August, 450. He could see it now, the exact shape of the finish. He allowed himself one quiet moment at the kitchen table, not celebration, just acknowledgement, then folded the ledger and went back out. That was when Dale's world finished collapsing. The deer fire had been a warning. The insurance decision had been a blow. The bank meeting had been a humiliation. When Dale drove out to Charlie's place after the Planning Commission, it was not to apologize or ask for help. It was to unload blame. He accused. He threatened. He said things he could not take back. Charlie listened until the words turned sharp enough to cut, then told Dale to leave. Dale left shaking, pride bleeding out into the dust. He went to the bank the next day and tried one more angle, suggested audits, hinted at wrongdoing. But Kenneth Hollister had a file in front of him that told a different story. 15 years of payments, no late notices, no excuses. Kenneth ended the conversation politely and firmly, and Dale walked out knowing he had no leverage left except anger. September arrived hot and clear, harvest weather, the kind that makes work feel possible again. On the 7th, Charlie drove into Kearney with cash in an envelope and paid the mortgage off. Kenneth processed the papers himself. He shook Charlie's hand and said his father would be proud. Charlie nodded, throat tight, and drove home with the deed in his jacket. A piece of paper heavier than any machine he had ever owned. He sat at the table that night and ran his fingers over his name, the legal description, the county seal. He did not smile. He breathed. 2 nights later, Dale Mortensen drove down County Road 17 in the dark with a gasoline can rattling in the bed of his truck, convinced that if he could not win, he could at least make sure no one else did either. Charlie was awake, sleeping in the barn, because he had learned to listen when something felt wrong. When the lights came on in the shed, when Dale froze with the can in his hands, the choice presented itself in a way Charlie had never imagined. He could call the sheriff. He could ruin Dale. He could end it. He did not. He talked about sons and consequences and tomorrow. Dale broke where no law could reach him. They cleaned the gasoline together. Don came pale and quiet. Dale went home smaller than he had ever been. Charlie watched the sun lift and felt the weight finally leave his chest. He had done what he set out to do. He owned his ground. The rest would take care of itself. By the time the first week of September settled in, Harlan County moved the way it always did before harvest, with a tired kind of urgency that didn't need to be announced, because everyone felt it in their shoulders and their sleep. Fields stood ready. Bins were checked. Men spoke less and listened more, because there was work ahead that couldn't be argued away. Charlie Hayes moved through those days with a quiet steadiness that looked ordinary from the outside and felt anything but on the inside. He had paid off the land, but he hadn't told many people yet, because he didn't trust the moment until it had aged a little. Freedom, he knew, was like fresh concrete. You didn't step on it too soon. He kept working, finishing the last repair jobs he'd promised, collecting cash, setting aside what he didn't need, and refusing to let himself imagine anything beyond the next task. The Farmall ran the way it always had, dependable, familiar, a sound he could hear even when it wasn't running, because it had been part of his life longer than most of the men who mocked it. Dale Mortensen, on the other hand, had reached the end of pretending. The fire, the insurance decision, the failed appeal to the bank, and the planning commission vote had stripped him down to what he could no longer hide. Men who used to linger near him at the cafe now finished their coffee and left. Conversations slowed when he entered rooms. Respect doesn't vanish loudly. It just stops showing up. Dale noticed every absence. He noticed how men asked Charlie questions now, how they nodded when Charlie spoke, how nobody laughed when Dale tried to talk about the way things used to be. He noticed how his son Billy watched him differently, quieter, more careful, like a boy who had learned that the man he depended on might not have all the answers. That look hurt Dale more than the bills. Pride can survive debt. It does not survive being seen clearly. Dale spent his days trying to outrun that feeling, driving his pickup too fast, making calls that went nowhere, rehearsing arguments in his head that no one would listen to anymore. At night, he drank and replayed the planning commission meeting. The raised hands, the way Vernon Pike had shut him down without raising his voice, the way Charlie Hayes had stood there and told the truth without apology. Dale told himself the county had turned against him. He told himself Charlie had humiliated him on purpose. He told himself he'd been cheated by timing, by weather, by insurance fine print, by bankers who didn't understand how hard farming was. He did not tell himself the one thing that mattered, because that truth required a kind of humility he did not yet have. Charlie felt the tension even as he tried to ignore it. He was not naive. He knew men sometimes did foolish things when they felt cornered. That was why he started sleeping in the barn again, not because he expected trouble, but because the habit of listening had served him well before. He lay on hay bales and stared at the dark rafters, thinking about his father, about the promise that had carried him through droughts and disappointments, about how close he'd come to losing it all to a letter with a bank logo on it. He thought about the planning commission meeting and the way the room had leaned toward him, without him asking it to. That support had felt good, but it also felt fragile. Communities, he knew, could turn just as quietly as they gathered. He did not want to give anyone a reason. He wanted the story to end the way it had begun, with work and restraint and no unnecessary noise. The night of September 11th was still and dark, the kind of night where sound carries farther than you expect. Charlie heard the truck before he saw it, the low idle, the pause on the county road, the door closing too carefully. He didn't move right away. He waited, listening, counting steps. When he flipped the light on in the equipment shed and saw Dale standing there with a gasoline can, Something settled inside him that felt like clarity rather than fear. This was not about tractors or land or banks anymore. This was about what kind of man Dale Mortensen was going to be from this moment on. Dale froze, eyes wide, caught between what he had planned and what he had not planned for. Charlie didn't shout. He didn't rush. He stepped inside and set his weight in a way that said he wasn't leaving. He told Dale he'd been sleeping in the barn, that he'd had a feeling. Dale tried to talk, words tumbling over each other, blame and accusation mixing with panic. Charlie listened until the words ran out. Then he asked about Billy. That question did what threats could not. It cut through Dale's anger and landed on the one place he hadn't armored. Dale's shoulders sagged. His voice broke. He looked small in that shed full of tools he didn't know how to use. Charlie laid out the choice simply, not like a judge, not like a saint, but like a man who understood consequences. Clean it up, go home. Tell your son you need help, or call the sheriff and let the rest of your life be decided for you. Dale cried, not loudly, not theatrically, but the way men do when they realize they've been lying to themselves for too long. They cleaned the gasoline together. They opened doors and let the fumes drift away. They did not talk much, because there was nothing left to say. When Dale drove away, the truck sounded different, slower, like it carried weight it hadn't before. Charlie sat on the tailgate and watched the dark thin into morning. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired and grateful and sad, all at once. Harvest began on time. Machines moved through fields under clear skies. Grain flowed. Charlie ran his equipment the way he always had, careful, attentive, fixing small problems before they became big ones. Men who passed by slowed down now, not to laugh, but to wave. The kind of wave that said they understood something they hadn't before. At the Longhorn Cafe, the talk stayed practical. No one mentioned the fire. No one mentioned the night in the shed. Stories like that don't belong to crowds. Kenneth Hollister sent Charlie the final paperwork confirming the mortgage satisfaction. Stamped and recorded, and Charlie filed it away in the same drawer as his notebook. Because even freedom needed a place to live. Dale sold off 80 acres before winter, then another 40 the year after. He kept farming, smaller, quieter, with equipment he could afford to maintain. He and Billy worked side by side, and people noticed that Dale spoke less and listened more. He never apologized to Charlie. Some men can't, but when their paths crossed, Dale nodded first, and Charlie nodded back. And that was enough. The Farmall kept running. Years passed. New machines came and went. Banks changed hands. Prices rose and fell. Charlie farmed his quarter section within his means, paid cash, fixed what broke, and slept well most nights. When he finally retired the Farmall in 1989, it went to a museum in Kearney with a small plaque that told a simple story. People stood in front of it and smiled, some because they remembered, some because they wished they had. Charlie didn't linger. He had never believed that machines deserved credit. People did. What mattered wasn't that he had refused progress. What mattered was that he had refused to be owned by it. In the years after that harvest, the story of Charlie Hayes did not spread the way big stories usually do, because it had no sharp edges for people to grab onto and no lesson that could be printed on a sign. And Charlie himself never told it in a way that invited retelling, which meant it stayed where it belonged, inside the county, inside kitchens and shops, and the quiet understanding that passes between people who have watched the same mistakes long enough to learn from them. Charlie kept farming the same way he always had, rising before daylight, checking whether the old way with his eyes and hands instead of trusting forecasts alone, planting and harvesting on a scale that matched his strength rather than his pride. The absence of a mortgage changed his days in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who had never lived under one, because it did not make him richer in the way people imagine, but it made every decision lighter, every setback survivable. Every good year something he could accept without fear of losing it to a letter with a bank logo. He stopped taking repair work once harvest was finished and winter set in. Not because he could not use the money, but because he had reached what he needed. And he understood the danger of letting one solution turn into another obligation. Men still called him sometimes, hoping he would make an exception, and sometimes he did. But only when it felt right, only when it stayed within the shape of the life he had chosen. At the Longhorn Cafe, the tone stayed different, quieter, more measured, as if the county had learned something it did not want to unlearn. Younger men still talked about new equipment and financing, because every generation does. But they listened more when older men spoke, and when someone said paid off or cash only. The table no longer laughed. Dale Mortensen became a presence that did not draw attention. He worked his smaller acres carefully, took fewer risks, fixed what he could himself and asked for help when he could not, and paid down what he owed instead of chasing what he could not afford. His son Billy grew up watching that change, absorbing it the way children absorb everything. And when Billy talked about farming, he talked about limits and timing and keeping options open. Words he would not have learned if the deer had never burned, and if his father had never stood in a shed holding a gasoline can with nowhere to go. Dale never thanked Charlie and never apologized, and Charlie never expected him to, because he had learned that some changes are private and some debts are paid in silence. The two men crossed paths often enough, at the elevator, at meetings, on gravel roads where one pickup slowed to let the other pass, and the nod they shared became a kind of truce, not born of forgiveness exactly, but of understanding, which is rarer and lasts longer. Kenneth Hollister retired from Farmers National in the mid-70s, and at his farewell, he told a story about a farmer who came in every month with an extra envelope and asked how fast he could make a balance disappear. And some people laughed and some nodded, and Charlie sat in the back and kept his hands folded, because being named had never been the point. The county changed the way counties always do, slowly and then all at once, with farms getting bigger and fewer, machines getting smarter and more expensive, banks getting farther away, names on signs changing even when the buildings did not. Through it all, Charlie stayed on his quarter section, adjusting where he had to and refusing where he could, because he had learned the difference between adapting and surrendering. He replaced equipment when it truly wore out, paying cash and buying used when new did not make sense. And when computers arrived in cabs and diagnostics replaced wrenches, he learned enough to get by and left the rest alone, trusting that the same patience that had carried him through debt would carry him through complexity. The Farmall M stayed in the shed long after it stopped being the primary machine, because Charlie believed you did not discard a thing that had earned its keep, and because he liked the way it reminded him of mornings when he had been younger and the future had been heavier. When he finally let it go in 1989, it was not because it failed him, but because he had nothing left to prove to it. The museum in Kearney wanted it as an example of mid-century agriculture, and Charlie agreed on the condition that the plaque be simple, no heroics, no speeches, just the year it was built and the work it did. People came and stood in front of it and told their own stories, and Charlie watched them from a distance once, then never went back, because the past did not need him standing guard over it. He spent his later years teaching Billy and a few other young men how to listen to ground and machines and themselves, not in formal lessons, but in the way real teaching happens, by letting them work and asking questions that did not have easy answers. When asked why he had never expanded, never taken on more land when prices were low and banks were eager, he said the same thing every time, that land is not just something you own. It is something that owns part of you, and he had already given it what he could afford to give. When asked about Dale, he said only that people do the best they can with what they understand at the time, and sometimes understanding comes too late to save you from pain, but early enough to save you from repeating it. As the years went on, fewer people remembered the jokes from the cafe or the broken fence or the night in the shed, but they remembered the feeling that settled over the county afterward, the sense that there was another way to measure success that did not involve keeping up or getting ahead, a way that valued sleeping well and keeping promises and knowing exactly what you owed and to whom. That feeling surfaced whenever markets turned or weather betrayed expectations, whenever someone considered signing a note that felt too big or buying a machine that solved the wrong problem, and more than one man backed away from a bad decision without being able to say exactly why, only that something about it felt wrong. Charlie grew older and slower, but not bitter, because bitterness is what grows when you feel cheated, and Charlie never believed he had been cheated only tested. When he died quietly in his sleep one winter morning, the county gathered in a way it rarely did anymore, filling a church that smelled of coffee and coats. And men stood and spoke about fences fixed and machines repaired and advice given without judgment. And not one of them mentioned tractors or banks, because those were never the heart of it. What they spoke about, in careful voices, was a man who did not rush, who did not boast, who did not surrender control of his life to forces he could not manage, and who believed that freedom was not something you won all at once, but something you built slowly, payment by payment, decision by decision, until one day you looked up and realized no one else held the deed to your time. Outside, the wind moved across the fields the way it always had, indifferent and constant, and somewhere not far away, a younger man paused before making a choice, remembering a story he had heard years before about an old tractor and a farmer who refused to be hurried. And in that pause, the story continued, doing the quiet work it had always done.